Welcome back to our lecture. The first service that we're going to take a look at in AWS is the Identity and Access Management Service, also known as IAM. The Identity and Access Management Service is a really important service within AWS. Essentially, it's the service that we use to manage all of the security credentials and policies within AWS. So IAM allows organizations to do things like create users and manage user access and roles and create security for AWS resources. The identity and access management policies allow you to create very granular governance controls. They allow you to federate access so you can set up an Active Directory system within your organization, and you can set up federated access into AWS, allowing your corporate users to use their corporate identity credentials to access AWS resources. You can set up things like password expiration and password strength rules. You can restrict access to specific services and resources within AWS. So IAM controls all of the security access to every single resource within AWS. Now, when you created your initial AWS account, when you initially signed up, you created what's called your root account. That's your master account. And it's the account that you use to initially log into AWS. The best practice is to not use that account for day-to-day management purposes. You use that account to set up your access with AWS and to set up your billing information. But the recommendation is to create a separate set of accounts to actually access AWS on a day-to-day basis to manage resources. Before we jump into the identity access management dashboard, there are a handful of terms that you need to know. The first is user. A user is an individual account that is set up within identity and access management. Typically, members of your organization would each have their own individual user account in AWS. A group is a set of users that share similar access privileges. You might set up like a development group or a testing group or a system administration group, and then you would associate individual users with a particular group. You can then assign a policy to a group, and that policy is then associated with all the users that are a member of that group. A role is an access privilege or a set of access privileges that can be assigned to AWS resources. Roles are really powerful within AWS. You can assign a role to something like an EC2 instance, and you can give that EC2 instance access to other AWS resources. So it's almost like you can treat something like an AWS instance as a user and assign a policy to that user so that a policy to that instance so that the instance can have access to other AWS resources. It's an incredibly handy feature within identity access management. And then finally, policy. A policy is a document that describes access privileges. You can think of a policy as a set of rules, a set of security rules. You can take a policy, you can and associate a policy with a user or a group or a role. And the policy then describes what the user group or role is able to do, what resources they're able to access and how they're able to access those resources. Okay, well, the next thing is to kind of show you how identity and access management works. And to do that, I'll pull up the AWS Identity and Access Management dashboard, and I encourage you to follow along on your own and perform some of the same steps that I'm doing here in this demonstration. Before I jump into the hands-on portion, there are a couple things to note. The Identity and Access Management service is a global service. Most of the other services that we'll work with in AWS are 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 regional services in the sense that when you're spinning up something like an EC2 instance, that EC2 instance is being created in a particular region within AWS. When you make changes within identity and access management, those changes take effect globally. Those changes can impact global resources. The other thing I should note is that at least in the beginning of this course, we'll do we'll do many of the configuration activities on AWS using the AWS Web Console. Pretty much everything that you can do in the Web Console, you can also do via command line using what an AWS CLI application, which we'll play with quite a bit this semester. I just wanted you to be aware that in practice, when we're working with AWS resources, most of the time we're actually using either a CLI tool or an API. It's actually fairly rare that I would use the AWS web interface to actually build and launch cloud resources. Most of the time we're doing that via some sort of automation or programmatic tooling. I'm going to pull up the dashboard here so we can take a look at it. I've already logged into the AWS console, and I'm going to go to the Identity and Access Management dashboard. I can do that by going into Services, and then if I look at the Security, Identity, and Compliance section over here, you can see Identity and Access Management. So I'll click on the IAM dashboard. When you access the dashboard, at the very top, it tells you your sign-in link. This is the sort of personalized website address that you can go to log into AWS. This link looks different for me than it does for you, and you can actually customize this link. So if you click on the customize link here, you can change this link to something that is perhaps more memorable. And I encourage you to do that if that's something you're interested in. The other thing that you can see in this dashboard is a series of these checks. AWS is going to create this sort of security report that shows you the security status of your account. And there are a number of different security recommendations that they will make. And you're encouraged to implement all of these different security steps. The first one is to activate multi-factor authentication on your root account. That's very easy to do, and I encourage you to go through that process. You can basically set up an application on your cell phone that generates a token. And when you log into AWS using your root account, which is the account you used to sign up to AWS, when you log in with that root account, you will also need to provide a one-time token, and that token is generated by the software running on your smartphone. That provides you with two-factor authentication, which is significantly more secure than just using a username and password to sign into AWS. In practice, in an industry, we always enable multi-factor authentication for all of our user accounts, not just the root account, but all the other individual accounts. And there are a number of other steps here, and I'll let you read through those different steps on your own. Okay, I'm going to arrange my screen here so I can follow some of these hands-on steps while looking at the dashboard here. The first thing I'm going to show you is how to create a new user account on the system. I do that by going to the users link in the navigation bar on the left, clicking on users, and I'm going to go ahead and click on the add user button. And in this case, I'm going to add a new user, and let's just call this user, we'll call it, I'm going to say J Smith. I'm pretending that I'm adding another employee to the corporate account. So I'm going to give this user a username, and then I'm going to specify an access type. And I can set this user up with I can create a programmatic user account. A programmatic user account is an account that is used by like a software application or some sort of tool I've created. It's not, I'm not going to be giving this user account to an actual person. It's going to be used in an application or an API. So that's a programmatic account. That account will not have access to this web-based interface. In this case, I want this account to be for another employee, and I want this person to have AWS Management Console access. So I'll set them up with AWS access. And then for their password, I can have the system generated password, or I can type in a custom password. And then finally, I can enable password reset, forcing this user to reset their password the first time that they log into their new account, which is a very good practice. Next, I can I can add this user to a group on the system. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and create a new group. I'm going to pretend that this person is a developer. So I'm going to say, I'm going to create a developer group, and I'm going to associate a policy with this group. In this case, I'm going to give them what's called power user access, which actually is a pretty powerful policy. Gives them access to pretty much everything except many of the identity and access management functions. So they won't be able to like make changes to the security settings, but they'll pretty much be able to access all of their other resources. And I'm not suggesting that power user access is the best policy for a developer team. It's probably not. I'm just using it as an example in this particular case. So I'm going to create the group, and this new user, Jay Smith, I'm creating is now associated with that group. I could associate this user with one or more groups on the system. That looks good. I'm going to click Next. I'm going to review the settings. It looks good. I'm going to create the user. And now the user settings have been created. The password is kind of blanked out. If I click on Show, and here's the password that's been automatically generated for this user account. Go ahead and close. Now if I look at my user list, you can see the J Smith user is there. Let me go ahead and click on that user and just show you a couple of things. If I click on that user, you can see that this user is a member of the Power User Group. If I click on Groups, you can see they're in the Developer Group. I'm going to click on Security Credentials, and you can see that they have a console password that's set. I can change that password if I want to. Here's the login link that the user will use to log into the web account. They've obviously never logged into the system yet. The most important thing I wanted to show you is this access keys section. Currently, this user has no access keys. Let me create an access key for the user. I'll do that by clicking on the Create Access Key button. And when I do that, AWS will automatically generate an access key ID and a secret access key. I'm going to click on Show. This is the only time I can ever see this secret access key. So at this point, I'd want to store these credentials in a secure location. The purpose of the access key ID and the secret access key is essentially to provide credentials to AWS. If I want to access AWS using the AWS CLI application or using some sort of API, I would pass in these credentials to AWS programmatically, and that essentially authenticates my user account with AWS in a programmatic way. So these credentials act just like my username and password, and they have to be stored in a very secure location because these are the true credentials that I would use to access the AWS resources. Okay, so I've created those credentials and now they're active, and I could use them in my software application or my tool if I wanted to. I'm going to go back up to the permissions tab here, and you can see it. I'm associated with this Power User Access permission. But what is this Power User Access permission? What does this policy allow me to do? I'm going to click on this down arrow, this arrow right next to the Power User Access policy. When I do that, it shows me a policy document. I'm not going to describe every line of this document. It's what's called a JSON document. And basically, this document is describing the security rules, or it's describing what type of access this user has in the AWS platform. You can see that it has a couple statements. The first statement says allow actions. Well, let me do the second part of it first, then I'll come back to the first. The second statement says allow access to these actions on any resource uh, within the account. So this user is able to um, access these is perform these IAM actions um, on any resource within the account. The first statement here is saying that essentially that um, the first statement is basically saying that this user is allowed to perform any action on any resource uh, as long as that action is not one of these. So essentially, the IAM or the organization's resources. So essentially, what this policy is saying is that this user is allowed to make any change to any resource within AWS as long as those resources aren't in the IAM or organization's set of resources. If it is within those IAM or organization set of resources, the user is allowed to do these limited activities or limited actions. That's what this policy is saying, and you can create very detailed, very elaborate policies that allow you to, you know, sort of configure the security permissions for a user or role or group in a very, very granular fashion. Okay, let me go back to the dashboard here, and we'll take a look at one other thing within IAM, which is roles. I'm going to click on roles. And I mentioned earlier that roles allow you to assign security policies to AWS resources, which is a really cool thing. So I can create a role, and I can, when I create a role, I can allow an AWS service to perform an action on my behalf. So, for example, I'm going to create a role for EC2, and my use case is I want to allow an EC2 instance to call an AWS service on my behalf. So I'll click on the EC2 use case and then select permissions. And maybe I want to set it up so that an EC2 instance can access something like an S3 bucket with read-only access. The IAM console and this wizard process then automatically creates a policy document for me. So this is a policy which allows access to S3, and it only allows the get and the list actions on S3 resources, which I think looks good. And so it's giving me a summary of, and then we can attach the policy to a particular entity. So we could attach a policy to a user, or we can attach it to a role on the system. And you'll be doing this actually in one of your upcoming assignments. I have you create a new role, and when you create that role, you will uh, then attach a policy to that role, and that policy will allow an EC2 instance to communicate with an S3 bucket.